I really feel for anyone who didn't grow up in the 80s. It was the decade of Rubik's Cubes, Commodore 64s, and Weird Al songs. Most of us tried dressing like Don Johnson at least once, or attempted growing that Motley Crue big hair. And if you didn't own a Sony Walkman by 1983, you were socially blackballed in the blink of an eye. Among all these trends, a breed of horror genre was coming of age, and there was no better decade than the 80s to usher in that era of the summer slasher flick. Of course, the 80s were incredibly diverse when it came to horror. Stephen King books were being made into movies as fast as he could write them. Vampire, werewolf, and ghost movies were totally tubular, and there was never a shortage of zombie movies. But it was that summer slasher flick that really left its mark as the de facto subgenre for the entire decade. Generally, when you think of 80s horror, you're picturing sex-crazed teenagers getting picked off in the most unspeakable ways, and the era is still paid homage to over 3 decades later, with movies such as The Final Girls and Down the Road. Of course, the most successful of the 80s slashers were the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises. Every year of the 80s, with the exception of 1983, one or both of those series came out with a new offering. But the decade was much more than that. Franchises like Sleepaway Camp and Prom Night really go a long way to make up the nucleus of the decade's playlist. I was 11 years old when Friday the 13th came out in 1980. It was the horror movie of my youth, and it will always be one of my favorites. But there was no better feeling of accomplishment than spending 45 minutes in some grubby, rug-torn video store, agonizing over whether to rent The Prowler, My Bloody Valentine, or visiting hours before saying bugger it and walking out with all 3. Back in those days, if you rented movies on a Friday night, you were given till Sunday at 5 p.m. to return them, which meant you were pulling at least one all-nighter if you wanted to squeeze them all in, something I did way too many times to count. I have to admit that among all the franchises of the 80s, the one that never really gelled with me was the Halloween franchise. I like the original, and still enjoy it to this day, but parts 2, 4, and 5 were simply not my cup of Earl Grey. Part 3, of course, was in a class by itself. It took a few times before it grew on me, and now it's one of those cult favorites I'll revisit from time to time. The 80s were a special time. So many things we take for granted today were in their infancy back then, from personal computers to Prozac. Anyone who came of age in that decade had a front row seat for a burst of innovation rarely equaled since. But the best front row seat was in your living room at 3 a.m., sitting on the couch in front of that old wood grain television set and hitting play on the top loader for another 84 minutes of blood-splattering fun. There was no better feeling in the world, and there was no better decade to experience it in. Oh, by the way, I never met a single person in my entire life who uttered the word tubular. Not in the 80s, not ever.